Welcome to the Other Side of DC podcast, where we explore the issue of community gun violence in the DC area. I'm your host, Amira Tripp Folsom. Here today with us is Ms. Tiffany Garner. Tiffany Garner currently serves as the Community Violence Initiative's State Manager for Giffords' Courage to Fight Gun Violence in Washington, D.C., where she works to prevent further firearm violence and homicides through advocacy and lobbying for legislation that establishes community-based violence intervention and prevention funding throughout the states. She is actively engaged in coalition building and community organizing at local and state levels, focusing on supporting violence prevention programs and strategies that will reduce community violence, specifically within communities of color. Tiffany received her bachelor's degree in organizational communication and master's degree in community counseling from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and has recently completed her Master's of Public Administration from Old Dominion University. She serves on the Emerging Leaders Council National Committee with the National Forum for Black Public Administrators, Virginia Board of Trustees Family and Children's Trust, and serves as a committee chairperson with Virginia Women Leading Government. Tiffany is native to North Carolina, where she spent over 7 years as a domestic violence therapist for children who have been exposed to intimate partner violence, as well as a manager for an innovative youthful offenders program focusing on teens who have perpetrated aggressive and violent behaviors within dating relationships. She has served as a trainer for law enforcement officers on the Lethality Assessment Program Maryland Model, a program that helps to identify victims of domestic violence who are at high risk of being seriously injured or killed by their intimate partners. In addition to all of this, Tiffany has continuously worked with law enforcement, researchers, and community partners across the country on federal and state grants focused on the implementation of innovative community-based strategies for reducing and preventing violent crime within vulnerable communities. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Amira. So glad to join you.
Yes, I'm so happy that you're here. So I am currently a Courage Fellow at Giffords, and Tiffany is one of my amazing mentors whom I have learned so much from. And in our past conversations, you've told me that instances of community gun violence are usually the result of unresolved trauma. From your experience as a therapist, what are some effective methods in addressing this unresolved trauma to prevent potential gun violence in the future?
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, my experience as being a therapist was absolutely just illuminating when it comes to dealing with just violence. And so, even though I primarily at the time addressed domestic violence, there's such an intersection between domestic violence and community gun violence, right? So a lot of the clients at the time, and I'm just kind of sharing this with you, so a lot of the clients at the time were really dealing with not only just those interpersonal relationships, but also when they go into their neighborhoods and their communities, they would see, hear the gunshots or see the dead bodies in the streets. And so that would really complicate the trauma that they all experience. So in dealing with unresolved trauma, it's just so important to first just be mindful of the importance and the need for mental health and counseling services. I think sometimes there's such an aversion, especially within communities of color, to not see, not seek help or not talk to someone about some of the experiences that one has, encountered. And especially if those traumatic experiences still result in, symptoms. Right. So there may be some physiological symptoms or some psychological symptoms that people experience and they just kind of push them to the side. Those indicators that there is trauma there, we can't ignore those. We really need to address those. And a lot of people are afraid because it's tough to dig and to really process those. But I encourage everyone to please seek professional counseling to work on the trauma and to heal so that you can really move forward. Because a lot of times, a lot of our young folks that we see in some of our programs, like violence interruption programs or prevention programs, when folks don't deal with those unresolved trauma or what we call the ACEs, like those, adverse childhood experiences, if you don't really address those and look at those root causes, the likelihood that you're going to participate or be a victim of violence in the future is greater, right? So anyway, I just said all that to say, very important to seek mental health therapy and know that it's okay to do so and take that stigma off, because that's the only way you're really going to uncover and process what's underneath so that you can have a more of a greater chance of having a successful future.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. Mental health services are
Hmm.
of the utmost importance, especially in Black communities
Yeah,
where like getting mental health services is so stigmatized.
absolutely.
And so you were a domestic violence therapist, which
Hmm.
is not, an easy path to take.
And
So,
no, not at all.
yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, what originally led you to domestic violence therapy, and how did you make that transition from therapy to gun violence prevention lobbying?
Yeah. Well, you know what? I always tell people, you know what? Life can lead you down some winding roads that, some twists and turns that you like, wait, how did I get here again? Yeah. Well, so I'm just gonna be honest. When I was in graduate school, I did not seek out to be a domestic violence therapist. Obviously, I was in school for community counseling and I thought I was gonna go down a different road. I distinctly remember, talking to my cohort at the time saying, I am not, working with no children. I'm not doing any of that, right? I was adamant, of things I wasn't going to do. But interestingly, I ended up being a therapist and primarily working with children that were impacted by domestic violence. So listen, you just never know where life leads you. But at the time, this was back in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had started attending just some community workshops around domestic violence just to get some understanding my own self. And it was at the same time that I was in graduate school or preparing to go to grad school. So I kind of became interested. And then I was also doing some internship work in the jails at the time. So working around women who were incarcerated for a variety of reasons. And a lot of them experienced domestic violence, and a lot of them were in jail because of domestic violence. So from there, it just became my thing, and I ended up in a career working with local government and doing that work. And the good news is also not only did I work on the side where people were victimized, families were victimized, but I also worked with perpetrators of domestic violence too. So that was an interesting balance. But what led me into lobbying? That's a big jump coming from mental health therapy. I came up here to the DC area. I didn't even really know anything about lobbying. But during my time here for the past about 5 years, I ended up applying for a job at Giffords that focused on community violence. And remember, I told you before, there's intersection between domestic violence and community violence. That was primarily the focus, but then there was a piece of this job that once I accepted the position had some lobbying aspects to it. So that just kind of exposed me to the world of how to champion policy that could really impact families and communities that were experiencing violence, but more so provide funding for these folks as well who are, experiencing communities just ravished by violence.
As a lobbyist, do you professionally advocate for the advancement of community gun violence prevention initiatives? So, walk us through what being a lobbyist for good looks like.
Oh, yeah. Well, remember, this is something that I did not necessarily know was going to be a part of my career path. So a lot of this past year has been a major learning curve for me to understand what, lobbying and, looks like. And I still have, a journey ahead of me to really get a stronger grasp on it. But this first year experience, I think it first starts off with, for me, now I can only tell you about my personal experience, what makes it good. It's a lot along the lines of personal conviction, right? Like for me, what drives me is because I've sat across from people who are impacted by this. And then I surround myself with partners who they are in the trenches doing this work every day, right? And so I hear their stories and hear their pleas for more funding and more policy, holistic policy that will help them save the lives of others. So for me, it's personal conviction. That's a start. And then secondly, it's really a lot of relationship building with legislators, especially those who are relatively understand the dynamics. And remember, community violence is really disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities. So having to reach out to legislators, lawmakers who could be open to understanding truly what's happening in these certain communities and even understanding the structural racism and historical race policies that create communities that are, disadvantaged by violence. So really trying to build and connect and even educate, because even there's some out there who are still open, right? They just need some basic education around what this is. So I spent a lot of time doing a lot of relationship building, a lot of helping folks understand what happens when you sustainably invest in funding violence prevention. And then after that, making sure that I assemble a good team, a good coalition behind me, so that when that legislation is up for a hearing, we are all rallying together with one voice to talk about how important it is. And then pretty much after that, just following where the legislation goes and just, of course, hoping for a win and a victory. Following that, just making sure you're staying vigilant to where that legislation is. I have a couple examples. We're doing some work up in Maryland around, trying to pass the Maryland VIP bill. And this February, it was able to pass in both chambers, both the House of Delegates as well as the Senate side. However, the governor vetoed that bill. So we had a coalition of members who we not only did we testify at the time, but we have consistently been really working with legislators over the summer and even currently trying to keep the bill before them so that when it's time for a special session, a veto override of the bill, we're still there. So I'm telling y'all that to say it's a constant relationship building. It's a constant staying connected with partners who will work with you in advocating for this, and just staying connected to those who sponsor the bill so that you can, stay vigilant to the progress and in any other ways we can introduce further legislation that will help these communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, with that relationship building and coalition building, you have extensive experience in community organizing from both the preventative and restorative approaches. So, what are some community based strategies that you have worked in and supported that you find to be successful?
I'll just speak first about what just kind of the organizing work that I've been doing this past year. And most of my organizing work is centered around the Violence Intervention Prevention Bill, which is where we tried to introduce it. We did introduce it in Maryland, and then also trying to work to gather some steam to introduce it in North Carolina and possibly in Connecticut, and making some traction in Pennsylvania as well. So some of the strategies that I guess I've kind of rallied around is the community-based approaches to how to prevent gun violence that is different from what a lot of folks tend to stand on. A lot of leaders and legislators tend to kind of look at the criminal justice approach, but for me, most of my partners that I work with on the ground are those who have figured out community strategies are the best way. So right now at Giffords, we will lift up and rally behind those who implement what they call focused deterrence strategies, which is where you have a cohort of law enforcement in addition to social service agencies, even the faith community that are involved in trying to reach out to those small percentage of people who are committing most of the gun violence within cities. So we have partners who are engaged in that work. And so I'll definitely support those initiatives, because you do need that's that holistic approach type of thing to try to get people to stop shooting, but provide them also with the resources that they need. Because a lot of times people can pick up guns and weapons as the last resort, but it's just like, hey, there's some other ways and there may be some other opportunities, because we all know once you pick up that gun, the consequences of that. And that's what Focus Deterrence does a lot of, trying to help people to learn about, here's the consequences if you make this choice, but here is another route you can take. So Focus Deterrence is one community based. It does have the law enforcement side, so some people kind of steer away from that. But the other approach is like cure violence that you'll hear a lot about too. And cure violence uses a lot of the violence interrupters, who these are people who have, maybe they've already engaged in gun violence or criminal activity, but they're changing their life, and so they're now out on the streets trying to help other people, like, mediate maybe situations that the tensions are high, and they're trying to stop the violence before it happens again. And these are people that have such a great, I guess, a pretty decent reputation and well respected, so that this strategy tends to work. But the focus is using community members to help the community reduce the violence. And so those are two examples. There are some other cities that may use a hybrid of some of these approaches, but the community investing within itself to help stop the violence is is the way, instead of more of the punitive criminal justice approach. That tends to be the way that I guess the strategies that I tend myself, as far as Giffords as well, will we tend to rally around these approaches. So there are also, I'm just going to say this last piece, there are some other initiatives that are on the ground where people are just kind of really being creative and just kind of use an approach that doesn't involve law enforcement at all, just really interesting, innovative things that are just kind of popping up around the country. So we'll definitely get on board with that. But those communities and those people that are doing this work, they need funding, which is what we will primarily champion in order to help them effectively do this work, because they're from the community, they know the community, and often they know what works to help save their community members' lives.
Yeah, and what I like about that in particular is that it addresses the fact that the people from these communities know how to solve their problems the best, and what they really need is support, not people coming in from the outside and imposing their own solutions on it when the community knows how to solve the problem itself. And so, with all of this, you do so much. So, what do you do to take care of yourself? And how do you think Black communities can prioritize mental health as a way to prevent gun violence?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I guess for saying that. I know we just did talk about me, well, with this job, but also just kind of finishing graduate school recently too. So self-care for me is very important. I believe in staying balanced. I think it's just vital for me. So for me, I definitely spend a lot of time like reading, and I'll go for walks, and I'll spend time with people who are in my support system. Of course, in this COVID time, that's going to be a little limited because again, not like I can see anybody, but at least we can talk on the phone and Zoom if I need to, just to stay grounded and to be around positive energy. That's so important for me. And then also just knowing when to just kind of check out. Sometimes if I just need to just binge watch, some mindless TV, or do something just to kind of take away. Because obviously, working in gun violence or even domestic violence prior to this stuff is heavy. This is not lightweight issues. So I always just kind of keep a check on myself to know when it's time to just let me step away. And then I can come back and bring my full self when I have balanced myself out. So, anyways, that's a little bit on how I take care of myself during COVID time. So, when it comes to Black communities prioritizing mental health, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about how important it is for us to remove that stigma. And there are just some people out there that are, really making some leeway into helping communities of color realize that it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you just because you're seeking help or you say, I'm not okay. Actually, we need you to say that. And it's self care to seek out an opportunity to sit and tell your story and to just find ways objectively from someone to just say, hey, this is maybe some methods and some strategies that will help you along your path. There's nothing wrong with that. And so once we remove that stigma first, and then hopefully we can point people to supportive services, helping our community members to realize that if you are not mentally balanced, you're not mentally well, it's going to be hard for you to do and fulfill purpose and to do and to be successful in life if you don't have your mental health in check first. So once we remove that stigma, we seek out supportive services. We understand that mental health is a starting point, and checking that unresolved trauma and not being afraid to do that. Those are some ways that we're going to prevent gun violence in the future. Because remember, I told you earlier that if we don't resolve that unresolved trauma, it creates opportunity for us to later on be victimized and to be caught up potentially in some cycles that could be consequences of choices. But I think that those are just a few steps that but I think more than anything is just that the stigma that it's okay to seek help, and that's actually a way to be more successful, is really a good starting place for a lot of this.
Yes, I completely agree. It's so important to seek out help when you need help. And when we think about Black mental health, I think we also need to think about it as collective and a community, and how not only are we protecting ourselves by caring for our mental health, but we're also protecting and caring for our communities as well. And so, Tiffany, do you have any last things that you would like to add, or any resources that you'd like to share with our audience?
can't think of any additional thing to add on that. I feel like you had some really good questions for me, which is great. And I hope I was able to just kind of share a little bit about an interesting path. But I think more than anything, I just keep in mind how preventable gun violence can be. And I think when we throw in that component of mental health, that to your point, what you just said, as a collective, it starts with each one of us individually, right? That we take care of who we are, make sure we are on a path towards health and wellness. But also, when we see our community members suffering, how can we jump in and help, right? And maybe jump in and how do you support violence intervention programs in your local areas? And even if you can't, through manpower support, maybe financially, how can you donate and support and help? Because these people are the ones that are doing such important work. I mean, we think about first responders as law enforcement and fire, which thank God for them. But we also have violence interrupters and our violence prevention folks who are on the scenes of gun violence. So imagine the trauma that they're holding within their bodies. But how can we support this work? Because they're the ones that are standing in the gap, hopefully preventing the future violence because they're the ones mediating the conflicts and trying to squash the beef that's going on. So I just want to really encourage people to pay attention to these violence prevention programs, support them, and understand their worth, especially during COVID, because they're not only increasing the peace, but they're also the ones that are delivering medical supplies, whether it's like masks, that's what I mean, like masks or food and stuff like that, just to keep their communities stable and healthy. So they're doing a double duty, right? Anyway, and in addition to please making sure that individually we work on our own mental health and encourage our community members to take that stigma off and seek the help that they need. So those are I just want to drive home those essential points too. So
Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your wisdom with all of the listeners of the podcast.
yeah, of course, hopefully this was helpful.
Yes, it definitely was. And I think that so many people will learn so much just from our conversation together. So this concludes this episode of The Other Side of DC. Thank you so much for listening.